Before dawn, 18-year-old Wren Calloway left Sulfur Flats with $17, a wool blanket, and everything she still owned tied across her shoulder. She climbed until the town became a scatter of rooftops far below. Near sunset, the trees thinned, and Harrow Ridge emerged, a windswept spine of granite.
Its roof had collapsed. Its window was empty. A massive fallen granite lintel nearly sealed the entrance. But Wren stepped closer.
She was 18 years old, standing in a clapboard building that smelled of dust, old paper, the faintest trace of mildew creeping from the floorboards. The morning light fell through a single window behind the clerk's desk, catching the motes that drifted through the air like tiny golden witnesses to what was about to happen. Wren Calloway placed a $10 gold eagle on the counter with a sound that was small, certain, final, the sound of a life-changing direction. The clerk, a man named Enfield, looked up from his paperwork. He was 55, balding with ink stains on his fingers that had become as permanent as birthmarks. His spectacles sat low on a nose shaped by decades of peering at documents no one else cared about. He recognized the girl. Everyone in Sulfur Flats knew the story by now. Garrett Calloway's daughter, the quiet one, turned out of her own home 3 days ago with $17 in a linen pouch. He had heard she spent the first night in the abandoned horse stall behind Taylor's warehouse, curled up in a wool blanket with nothing but the cold mountain air for company. Now she stood before him, her back straight, her voice carrying not a tremor of uncertainty. "I want to purchase the deed to the Mercer Stake on Harrow Ridge." Enfield blinked twice behind his spectacles. He wanted to say something, perhaps a warning, perhaps a kindness, perhaps some fatherly word about the foolishness of what she was proposing. She did not give him that chance. Her eyes held his with an unsettling calm, the gaze of someone who had already made a decision so deep inside herself that no external argument could reach it. "Filing fee plus back taxes," he muttered, turning to a dusty cabinet in the corner. He pulled open a drawer that resisted with the stubbornness of years, rifled through yellowed documents until he found the one he needed. The deed to the Mercer Stake. Mining. Stake, a mining claim on the highest ridge above town, abandoned for 15 years, considered worthless by every person who had ever given it a second thought. He placed the brittle paper on the counter between them. "Comes to $15. She untied the linen pouch, counted out the coins one by one, each clink against the wood a small percussion, a tiny heartbeat. $15. She signed her name on the line marked owner in a hand that was firm, unhurried, precise. Wren Calloway. She folded the deed, tucked it inside her shirt against her skin, picked up the pouch with its remaining $2, turned without another word, walked out into the April sunlight of Sulfur Flats, Colorado, in the year of our Lord 1887. She had just spent nearly everything she owned on a hole in a mountain that the entire town knew was worthless. She was now the legal owner of a piece of rock, wind, sky. $2 to her name. The clerk watched her go through the window, shook his head slowly, dipped his pen back into the inkwell. He had seen foolishness before. This, he thought, was something else entirely. He just didn't know what to call it. But to understand why Wren Calloway walked into that office with such terrible certainty, you must go back. Back before the deed, before the $17, before the cold morning she was told to leave the only home she had ever known. You must go back to the beginning, to the quarries west of town, to the sound of a hammer striking stone, to a man who spoke little but understood the world in a way that most people never would. Cormac Calloway was a stonemason. He had been born in the mountains of Appalachia, raised among men who pulled their living from rock, splitting it, shaping it, laying it into walls that would stand for 100 years. He came west to Colorado in 1860, not for gold, not for silver, but because the mountains called to him with a voice only a stoneman could hear. He found work in the quarries outside the settlement that would become Sulfur Flats, married a woman named May, who laughed easily, had a son named Garrett, who preferred numbers to stone, then watched Garrett marry, have a daughter. That daughter was Wren. From the time she could walk without stumbling, Wren was Cormac's shadow. Not because anyone told her to be, but because something in her recognized something in him, a quietness, a patience, a way of being in the world that felt more true than anything else she had encountered in her short life. She followed him to the quarries on mornings, when the mist still clung to the valley floor, her small boots leaving prints beside his large ones in the damp earth. She watched him work with a focus that was unusual in a child, her dark eyes tracking his hands as they moved over the face of a newly split boulder. He never gave her toys. He gave her tools, a small chipping hammer with a worn hickory handle sized for her grip, a plumb bob of polished brass that caught the light when she held it up, a folding rule made of boxwood, its brass hinges smooth with use, marked with figures she learned to read before she learned her letters. These were not gifts sus in the way most adults give gifts to children. They were invitations into a world, a language, a way of seeing that would shape everything she became. Cormac taught her to read stone, not the way a geologist reads it, with Latin names for minerals, with theories about pressure, with the detached curiosity of science. He taught her to read it the way a stonemason reads it, with his hands, his ears, his instinct. He showed her the grain that ran through granite, like the grain in wood, the hidden lines that told you where the stone would break clean, where it would shatter into useless rubble. He taught her to tap a boulder with the flat of the hammer, to listen to the sound it made, a dull thud, meaning a flaw inside, a fracture waiting to betray you, a clean ring meaning solid, true, ready to be shaped. "Listen to it, Wren, girl," he would murmur, his voice low, almost reverent, as if they were in a church rather than a quarry. Everything has a voice if you're quiet enough to hear it. He taught her that a foundation was not merely a matter of stacking stones. It was a conversation with gravity, with the weight of what would rest above, with the push of seasons, frost heaving the earth upward in winter, rain washing from the soil sideways in spring, the slow, heavy hand of time pressing down on everything, year after year. A foundation built wrong would stand for a while, maybe a few years, maybe a decade. Then one morning you would find a crack running through the wall like a scar, the whole structure leaning a degree or two from true, the beginning of an inevitable collapse. A foundation built right would outlast the person who built it. He was a patient teacher. She was a patient student. Other children in Sulfur Flats spent their afternoons playing in the creek, chasing each other through the dusty streets, sitting in the shade of the general store eating penny candy. Wren spent hers in the quarry, in the cool shadow of freshly split stone, learning the difference between limestone that would hold a sharp edge for a century, granite that would weather beautifully as it aged, sandstone that looked strong but crumbled under pressure, a lesson she would later understand that applied to far more than rock. She absorbed his craft not as a series of lessons, but as a way of being. The way some children learn music by growing up in a house full of song, Wren learned stone by growing up in the presence of a man who understood it the way most people understand speech. It entered her through her hands, her eyes, the soles of her hands, the soles of her feet, as she stood on the quarry floor, feeling the vibration of a hammer strike travel through the bedrock beneath her. Her mother, May, was the source of the home's warmth. She was a woman whose presence was a gentle hum of activity, the smell of bread rising in the oven, the rhythmic clack of knitting needles by the evening fire, the soft melody of a song hummed while she mended a shirt or swept the kitchen floor. May's love was expressed in these small, constant acts of care, the kind that are so woven into the fabric of daily life that you do not notice them until they are gone. But it was Cormac who gave Wren her stillness, her self-reliance, her ability to stand in a silence without needing to fill it. May gave her warmth. Cormac gave her structure. Together, they built a childhood that, while not wealthy, was solid, a foundation laid true. Then the fever came. It swept through the valley in the summer of 1883, a cruel, indiscriminate thing that moved from house to house like a debt collector, taking what it wanted without regard for fairness or mercy. May Calloway was not the first to fall ill, nor was she the last, but she was the one who mattered to Wren. The illness took hold on a Tuesday, a slight cough, a flush in the cheeks, a warmth in the forehead that May dismissed with a wave of her hand. By Friday she could not rise from the bed. By Sunday the cough had deepened into something wet, something that sounded like drowning. Doc Pruitt came twice a day, his face a careful mask of professional composure that could not quite hide the helplessness underneath. He left bottles of tincture, instructions for cool compresses, words of cautious optimism that grew less convincing with each visit. Garrett sat by the bedside, holding May's hand, his ledger forgotten on the desk. In the parlor, his world reduced to the small, terrifying space between one labored breath and the next. Wren was not allowed in the room. She stood in the hallway outside the closed door, her back against the wall, listening to the sounds that came through the thin wood, the murmur of voices, the rustle of sheets, the coughing that seemed to go on forever, each fit worse than the last. She pressed her shoulder blades into the solid plaster behind her, needing something firm to lean against because everything else was giving way. May died on a Wednesday morning, when the light through the bedroom window was golden, warm, the kind of light that belongs to a world where nothing terrible is happening. Wren was 14 years old. The warmth in their small house seemed to gutter out like a candle in a draught, leaving behind a cold silence that her father, a man more comfortable with columns of figures than with the raw, ungovernable territory of grief, could not fill. He tried. In his way, he tried. He cooked meals that tasted like nothing. He sat in the parlor in the evenings, staring at the chair where May used to read, his hands folded in his lap with nowhere to go. He spoke to Wren in short, careful sentences as if grief were a language he had never learned, each word chosen with the painful deliberation of a foreigner ordering a meal. Cormac understood. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not tell Wren that time would heal, that May was in a better place, that everything happened for a reason. He knew that none of those things were true in the moment of loss, that they were things people said to fill the unbearable silence, to paper over the crack in the world, to make themselves feel useful when they were not. Instead, on the third day after the funeral, he took Wren to the creek bed north of town. The morning was cool, the air carrying the mineral scent of water over stone. He walked slowly, his boots finding the flat rocks in the shallow current with the ease of long practice. Wren followed, her eyes swollen, her body moving with the mechanical obedience of someone who has run out of reasons to resist. He stopped at a bend where the creek widened into a shallow pool, the bottom covered with stones of every size, rounded, smoothed, polished by the water's patient work over uncountable years. He knelt, his knees settling into the wet gravel, his large hands moving through the stones with a tenderness that seemed impossible for fingers that had spent a lifetime breaking rock. He found what he was looking for, a stone no bigger than her palm, its surface the color of a winter sky gray with a wash of blue, smooth as glass, cool to the touch. He turned it over. On the underside, pressed into the surface, as if drawn there by a careful hand, was the perfect, delicate imprint of a fossilized fern, a tiny ghost of a leaf that had lived 1,000 centuries ago, its shape preserved in stone long after the plant itself had turned to dust. He placed it in her palm, closed her fingers around it. "See?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Even the hardest things can hold a memory of something beautiful. Don't you forget that?" She looked at the stone in her hand. The fern was so detailed she could see the individual fronds, the tiny veins that had once carried life through the leaf. It was impossibly fragile-looking, then yet it had survived inside the stone. The forest, the swamp, the entire world that had produced it, had vanished without a trace. The beautiful thing was gone. The memory of it remained, held safe in something strong enough to carry it through time. That stone became her most treasured possession. It lived in her pocket from that day forward, its smooth weight a constant presence against her thigh, a grounding thing, a touchstone in the most literal sense of the word. When the world felt uncertain, when the silence in the house pressed too hard against her chest, she would slip her hand into her pocket, close her fingers around the cool surface, feel the fern's imprint against her skin. It was not comfort exactly. It was something harder than comfort, something more durable. It was proof that the things we love do not simply disappear. They leave their shape in us, pressed deep, permanent as fossil in stone. Cormac passed 2 years later. He did not die of illness or accident, but of the slow, quiet erosion that takes old men, his body simply running out of the will to continue. He worked in the quarry until the last week, his hammer strokes growing slower, his aim still true. On the final morning, he sat down on a block of unfinished granite, leaned his back against the quarry wall, closed his eyes against the morning sun that fell warm on his face. When Wren found him in the afternoon, he looked as if he had simply decided to rest. She was 16. The world she had known was now reduced to its bare elements. Mother gone, grandfather gone, father present but unreachable. A man sitting across the dinner table every evening with the distant expression of someone doing arithmetic in his head, calculating the weight of his own loneliness, arriving at a sum he could not bear. Without Cormac, without May, the house became just a building. 4 walls, a roof, a door, the spaces where warmth had lived, the kitchen where May hummed, the workshop where Cormac sharpened tools became silent rooms that Wren passed through like a ghost in her own home. She filled the emptiness the only way she knew how, with work. She mended the fence along the south side of the property, resetting the posts that had leaned over the winter. She pulled the loose stones from the front walkway, relaid them with proper bedding, tamped them flat, made them true. She sharpened the axe, split firewood, stacked it in a rick against the east wall, with the obsessive neatness of someone who needs at least one thing in her life to be orderly. Something that faded from the window stayed. Her father watched her from the window sometimes. He could feel gaze on her back as she worked, a weight without warmth. He never came outside to join her. He never asked what she was building, why she was building it, whether she needed help. The distance between them grew wider with each passing month, a gap that neither of them had the tools to bridge. She, because she had inherited Cormac's stoicism, her grief locked inside her like water behind a dam. He, because he had never learned to speak the language of emotion in the first place. His entire inner life conducted in the silent columns of a ledger. When Garrett remarried in the spring of 1886, he presented it to Wren as a practical matter. The house needed a woman's touch, he explained, his eyes focused on a point slightly above her left shoulder. Unable to meet her gaze directly, Vivian was a widow from Denver, a woman of means, a woman who understood how a household should be run. Wren Calloway arrived in Sulfur Flats on a Tuesday afternoon in April, riding in a hired coach with 3 trunks of belongings, a set of dark heavy furniture that would be delivered by freight the following week. She was a woman in her mid-40s, her posture rigid, her clothing severe, her eyes possessing the particular sharpness of someone who has spent a lifetime cataloging the shortcomings of others. She was not cruel in the dramatic sense. She did not shout, did not strike, did not indulge in the theatrical villainy of fairy tales. Her cruelty was of a quieter, more efficient variety. It was the cruelty of erasure. Within a month, the house was unrecognizable. May's worn armchair, the one by the window where she had read in the evenings, its cushion shaped by the familiar contour of her body, was reupholstered in stiff, unwelcoming damask. The kitchen, which had always smelled of yeast, cinnamon, the warm living scent of bread rising, now smelled of lye soap, the sterile, aggressive cleanness of a hospital ward. The curtains were changed. The rugs were replaced. The small watercolor painting May had hung above the mantel, a scene of wildflowers she had painted herself. Its colors, faded but still carrying the ghost of her hand, was taken down, replaced by a framed sampler bearing a Bible verse about the virtues of an orderly home. Vivian saw Wren not as a daughter to be embraced, but as a problem to be managed. The girl was a living, breathing reminder that another woman had occupied this space before her, had been loved here, had left traces that no amount of lye soap could fully remove. Wren's competence, the skills Cormac had taught her, the easy way she handled tools, the quiet confidence with which she moved through physical work was not admired. It was an affront. A young woman had no business knowing how to sharpen an axe or mix mortar. Her calloused hands were evidence of something improper, something unfeminine, something that reflected poorly on the household. Vivian made her position clear in a dozen small ways. A comment at dinner about the state of Wren's fingernails. A pointed observation about the mud on her boots. A suggestion, delivered with the thin smile of someone offering advice they know will not be taken, that perhaps Wren should spend less time in the yard with tools better suited to a hired man. Garrett said nothing during these exchanges. He sat at his end of the table, his eyes on his plate, his silence, a wall he hid behind, a fortress of cowardice he called keeping the peace. Wren did not argue. She did not defend herself. She had Cormac's stillness in her, that ability to absorb a blow without flinching, to let the force of it pass through her into the ground beneath her feet. She retreated to her attic room, the small space under the eaves that had been hers since childhood, the one place Vivian's renovation had not yet reached. She lay on her narrow bed in the evenings, listening to the muffled sounds of her father's conversation with his new wife, drifting up through the floorboards, a murmur of words she could not quite make out, a low, continuous sound like water running underground, hidden beyond her reach. She was becoming a stranger in her own home. The foundation of her life was cracking beneath her feet, slowly, silently, the way a wall cracks when the ground shifts, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a hairline fracture that widens by degrees, imperceptible at first, then unmistakable, then irreparable. She could read the fault line in this situation with the same certainty she could read one in a piece of granite. It would not hold. The end came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of paper. It was a Tuesday evening in late March 1887. The air outside still held the bite of the high country's retreating winter, the last crusts of snow clinging to the north-facing slopes above town like white scars on dark skin. Inside the house, the parlor now entirely Vivian's domain, furnished with the dark, heavy pieces she had brought from Denver, furniture that seemed designed to absorb light rather than reflect. It was lit by a single oil lamp that cast more shadow than illumination. Garrett sat in a straight-backed chair near the fireplace. His hands were clasped in his lap, the knuckles white, the tendons standing out like cords. His gaze was fixed on a point on the far wall, a particular spot on the wallpaper that he seemed to find endlessly absorbing, as if by staring at it hard enough he could disappear into the pattern. Vivian sat opposite him, her posture erect, her hands folded with the composed precision of a woman who has rehearsed this moment. On the polished table between them lay two documents, a deed of sale, a bank ledger. They called Wren down from the attic. She stood in the doorway of the parlor, still wearing her work clothes, the heavy canvas trousers Cormac had bought for her 2 years ago, now worn thin at the knees, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hands rough from an afternoon spent resetting the stone border along the garden path. She looked at her father. She looked at Vivian. She looked at the documents on the table. The geometry of the scene told her everything. The geometry of the scene told her everything was spoken the angles of their bodies, the careful distance between the chairs, the way Vivian's chin was lifted slightly, the way Garrett's was lowered. This was not a conversation. It was a verdict. Wren. Her father's voice was thin, strained, a wire pulled too tight. Vivian, we have decided to sell this house. We'll be moving to Denver, to her family's property. It's a better opportunity. He paused. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of all the things he was not saying, the explanations he did not have the courage to offer, the apologies he did not have the language to make. Vivian filled it. You are 18 now, of legal age. Her voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone completing a transaction. It is time for you to make your own way. She reached forward, pushed a small linen pouch across the polished surface of the table. The coins inside made a dull, dismissive sound, the sound of a life being summarized, totaled, closed out. $17. It is a generous amount for a girl starting out. Wren looked at the pouch. She looked at her father's hands, the fingers interlocked so tightly that the blood had left them, the knuckles bone white, the grip of a man holding on to something invisible, something that was slipping away from him despite his desperate grasp. He knew. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way the muscle there jumped once, twice, a tiny involuntary spasm of conscience. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He was choosing to do it anyway, because Vivian's certainty was way easier to live inside than his own doubt, because her direction, even when it pointed toward cruelty, was preferable to the terrifying emptiness of making his own decisions. Wren had watched this moment approach for months. The way a person standing on a high ridge watches a storm build on the horizon, the darkening sky, the first distant flicker of lightning, the slow, inexorable roll of thunder growing closer. The house was already sold. The decision was already made. She was an entry in a ledger that had been balanced, a line item that had been resolved. She did not cry. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not make the plea that some part of her, the part that was still 14 years old, still standing in the hallway outside her mother's sick room, still waiting for someone to open the door, wanted desperately to make. She had learned from Cormac that some stones cannot be moved, that some fractures cannot be repaired, that the only honest response to a wall that has failed is to stop leaning against it. She nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her head, precise as a hammer strike. "I'll get my things." Vivienne gave a curt nod. "Be gone by morning." The new owners arrived before noon. Wren climbed the narrow stairs to the attic for the last time. The room was small, barely large enough for the bed, a nightstand, a wooden chest that had been her mother's. The ceiling sloped with the pitch of the roof, forcing her to duck near the walls. She had spent 12 years in this room, every night of her life since she was old enough to sleep alone. The window looked east toward the mountains. On clear mornings, she could see the ridgeline above town, the high spine of rock that caught the first light of dawn while the valley below still lay in shadow. There was little to pack. A change of clothes, her other shirt, wool sock, a heavy jacket that had been Cormac's, too large for her but warm. The chipping hammer with the hickory handle. The boxwood folding rule, its brass hinges still smooth, still precise. She wrapped everything in the wool blanket from her bed, tied the bundle with a length of rope. Lastly, she went to the nightstand, opened the small box where the small parmet, her most private things, a ribbon that had been her mother's, a sketch Cormac had drawn of the quarry, the fossil stone. She picked up the stone, held it in her palm. The fern imprint was as sharp, as delicate as the day Cormac had placed it in her hand by the creek. She slipped it into her trouser pocket, felt its familiar weight settle against her thigh. She closed the box, left it on the nightstand. She did not look around the room. She did not allow herself to feel the loss of it. If she allowed those memories to surface now, they would pull her under. So she sealed them away, the way Cormac had taught her to seal a joint in stonework tight, true, no gaps for weakness to enter. She went down the stairs, carrying her bundle over one shoulder. She walked through the kitchen, Vivienne's kitchen now, scrubbed clean of every trace of May, through the back door, out into the cold night air. She did not look back at the house. She did not look at the man who was her father, who was still sitting in the parlor, staring at the polished surface of the table as if the grain of the wood held some answer, some absolution, some way to undo what he had just done, without having to admit that he had done it. The back door closed behind her with a soft click, not a slam. Wren Calloway was not a person who slammed doors. She was a person who closed them quietly, completely, then walked away. The journey began in the pre-dawn gray. Sulfur Flat lay still beneath a thin veil of mist, the buildings along Main Street dark, the railroad depot silent, the whole town suspended in the particular hush that belongs to the hour before the world remembers it has work to do. A dog barked once, somewhere near the livery stable, then fell quiet. The smell of cold earth, wood smoke from banked fires, the mineral tang of the creek that ran through the south end of town. These were the last scents of her old life, carried to her on a breeze so slight it barely moved the hair at her temples. She walked north, not west toward the flatlands where the railroad ran to Denver, not east toward the next town, where she might have found work as a shop girl, a laundress, a domestic. North, straight into the mountains that loomed above the valley like something patient, something waiting. The main road gave way to a logging track. Within a mile, the packed dirt surface rutted by the heavy wheels of timber wagons, the ruts now filled with the last meltwater of spring. The logging track gave way to a game trail, narrow, steep, switchbacking through dense stands of ponderosa pine, whose trunks rose straight as columns in a cathedral, their bark the color of cinnamon, their branches interlocking high above to form a canopy that filtered the growing light into shafts of pale gold. The air changed as she climbed. It grew cooler, thinner, stripped of the valley's dampness, carrying instead the sharp, clean scent of pine resin, the mineral smell of exposed rock, the faint sweetness of snowmelt running unseen beneath the forest floor. The sounds of town faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of wind through high branches, the steady rhythmic crunch of her boots on rocky soil, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot that sent a squirrel spiraling up the nearest trunk in a gray blur of panic. She walked with a purpose born not of a clear destination, but of a deep instinctual need for higher ground, the need to climb when the world below has collapsed. This is not a thing learned, but the thing felt, ancient as the mountains themselves. Her body, hardened by years of physical labor, settled into the rhythm of the ascent. The muscles in her legs burned with a clean, honest ache that was nothing like the dull, suffocating pain of what she had left behind. The weight of the bundle on her back was a steady ground pressure, each step driving the earth away beneath her, each step lifting her a little farther from the place where she had been unwanted. She paid attention to the world around her with the focused calm Cormac had taught her. She noted the granite outcroppings along the trail, their weathered faces streaked with pale green lichen, their fracture lines running at angles that told her the bedrock here was stable, compressed by the weight of the mountain above into something dense, enduring. She saw the tracks of a deer pressed into the soft earth near a seep spring, two sharp crescents, the imprint of a hoof that had paused here to drink, then moved on. She watched a red-tailed hawk circle on an updraft far above, its wings motionless, riding the invisible architecture of the wind with an ease that made flight look like the simplest thing in the world. This was a landscape that demanded respect. It was vast, indifferent, a world of stone, sky, distances that made human concerns seem very small. The mountains did not care about Garrett Calloway's cowardice, about Vivian's sharp propriety, about $17 in a linen pouch. The mountains had been here before any of them were born. They would remain long after all of them were dust. There was a comfort in that, a cold comfort, but a real one. A kind of freedom that comes from standing in a place so large that your own smallness becomes not a humiliation but a relief. No one in this wilderness knew her name. No one knew her history. She was just a moving figure in a vast, ancient place, as insignificant as the hawk above, the deer that had drunk at the spring, the lichen that grew on the stone. There was peace in that anonymity, a stripping away of everything that was not essential. She was not Garrett's daughter. She was not Garrett's daughter. She was not Vivian's problem. She was not the orphan, the outcast, the girl who had been given $17 in lieu of a family. She was a body climbing a mountain. She was breath, muscle, bone, the steady percussion of boot on rock. Nothing more, nothing less. By midday, she had climbed above the thickest belt of forest into a region of stunted, wind-twisted pines whose trunks grew at angles that spoke of decades spent leaning away from the prevailing westerlies. Open meadows appeared between the groves, their grasses still winter-brown at the edges, but already showing the first green shoots of spring, dotted with wild flowers, purple columbine, yellow arnica that bloomed in defiance of the altitude, the cold, the thin air that could not support the lush growth of the valley below. She stopped by a small, clear spring that bubbled up from between two slabs of granite, its water so cold it made her teeth ache when she drank. She refilled the canteen she had taken from the kitchen, the one item she had allowed herself to steal, if stealing was the right word for taking a battered tin canteen from a house that was no longer yours. She ate the piece of bread she had saved from yesterday's meal, chewing slowly, tasting the yeast, the salt, the faint sweetness of wheat. From this vantage point, the whole valley lay spread beneath her like a map drawn by a careful hand. Sulfur Flats was a neat grid of streets, rooftops catching the noon sun, the railroad a thin silver thread stitching the town to the wider world. The creek glinted as it wound through the south end of town, past the livery, past the boarding house, past the small white church, whose steeple was the tallest structure for miles. The house where she had been born, where her mother had died, where her grandfather had taught her. The weight of a plumb bob was an indistinct shape among other indistinct shapes. Part of a life like felt something she had read about rather than something she had lived. She felt no anger sitting there, no self-pity. There was only the simple, undeniable fact of her own existence. She was here, on this mountain, with $2 remaining, a wool blanket, a chipping hammer, a folding rule, a fossil stone in her pocket. She was alive. The sun was warm on her face. The water in the spring was cold, clean, good. These were facts. She could build on facts. She rose, shouldered her bundle, continued climbing. As the sun began to drop toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the canyons that cut through the mountainside like the wrinkles in an old man's face, she reached the place she had been moving toward without fully knowing it, the way a compass needle turns north, not by choice but by nature. Harrow Ridge. The highest spine of exposed rock above Sulfur Flats, a narrow windswept crest where the last trees gave way to alpine tundra, where the sky seemed close enough to touch, where the air was so thin it tasted of nothing but itself. The ridge ran north to south, a wall of granite thrust upward by forces so old they had no name, its eastern face dropping steeply into a canyon, its western face sloping more gently toward the valley far below. There, built into a shallow declivity on the eastern face, sheltered from the worst of the western wind, oriented to catch the morning sun, was the thing she had come for, though she had not admitted it to herself until this moment. The abandoned dugout of the old Mercer Stake. She had heard about it. Everyone in Sulfur Flats had. Obadiah Mercer, the crazy old miner who tried to dig a fortune out of solid granite, who lived alone on the ridge for years after his wife died, who came down to town in 1872, looking like he'd been carved from the same rock he'd spent his life breaking. The claim was considered worthless, the dugout a ruin, the whole story a cautionary tale about what happens when a man lets grief drive him up a mountain he has no business living on. She stood before it now in the fading light. The roof had collapsed inward, a tangle of rotted timbers, decomposed sod, the skeletal remains of a structure that had once kept out the weather. The single window opening was a dark, empty rectangle. The doorway was partially blocked by a fallen lintel, a heavy slab of granite that had slipped from its position above the frame, coming to rest at an angle that looked almost deliberate, as if the dugout were closing its own door, sealing itself against the outside world. But the walls were still standing. 3 of the 4 were the living rock of the mountain itself, the back wall, the 2 side walls carved from the bedrock with tools that must have taken months to wield. The front wall was man-made, dry-stacked granite, fitted together with a skill that made Wren's breath catch in her throat. The stones were chosen for shape, for size, for the way they locked together without mortar, each one bearing the weight of the one above, distributing force downward through the wall into the bedrock below. It was the work of someone who understood stone not as a material to be conquered, but as a partner to be respected. The chimney rose from the right side of the front wall, a column of carefully stacked stone that climbed 6 feet above, where the roofline had been still straight, still plumb, after 15 years of wind, snow, the freeze-thaw cycles that could crack granite if the joints were not true. Cormac would have approved. She sat on the flat rock beside the entrance, her bundle at her feet, the fossil stone in her pocket pressed against her thigh, familiar, grounding. The cold was coming down from the peaks, the temperature dropping as the sun disappeared. She pulled the wool blanket from the bundle, wrapped it around her shoulders. She would sleep out here tonight. Inside was too choked with debris to enter, but tomorrow she would begin. She did not know yet about the metal box hidden behind a loose stone in the hearth. She did not know about the letter, the money, the small carved bird that had belonged to a child named Rosie. Those discoveries lay ahead of her, sealed in stone, waiting with the patience that only stone possesses. What she knew sitting on that rock in the gathering dark, the stars appearing one by one in the vast Colorado sky above her, the owl calling from somewhere in the canyon below, was simpler than all of that. She knew the walls were true. She knew the chimney was sound. She knew that what everyone else saw as worthless, she could see as something that only needed the right hands to bring it back. Her grandfather's voice came to her then, not as memory but as something closer, something that lived in her bones the way the fern lived in the fossil stone, permanent, preserved, pressed deep. Stone doesn't lie, Wren girl. People lie. Learn to read stone first. Then you'll know which people to trust. She wrapped the blanket tighter. The cold was sharp now, the kind that bites at exposed skin, that finds the gaps in clothes with the persistence of water finding cracks in rock. She did not mind it. Cold was honest. Cold told you exactly what it was, made no pretense of warmth, offered no false comfort. She preferred it to the suffocating warmth of the parlor where her father had sat with his white knuckles, his averted eyes, his silence that was louder than anything Vivian had said. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the stunted pines with a sound like breathing slow, deep, the respiration of something immense, something patient, something that had been here long before her troubles began. She slept. When she woke, the eastern sky was a thin line of pale gold above the canyon rim. The air was crystalline, motionless, so clear she could see individual trees on the slopes miles away. Frost had formed on the wool blanket during the night, a delicate lacework of ice that caught the first light, glittered briefly, then vanished as the sun climbed. She stood, shook the blanket out, folded it. Her body was stiff from sleeping on stone, her joints protesting the cold, her muscles remembering yesterday's climb with a deep, thorough ache. She ignored it, ate the last of her bread, drank from the spring she found exactly where she expected it, 100 yards east, bubbling up through a crack in the granite into a natural basin the size of a washbowl, the water so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. Then she walked back to the dugout. In the morning light, she studied it with the methodical attention Cormac had taught her. She spent 3 hours examining every stone, every joint, every angle. The front wall sound, no major settling. The stones still locked tight. The chimney, straight, clear. The mortar between the stones, hard as the stone itself. The hearth visible through the collapsed roof debris, massive, built of carefully chosen stones with a deep firebox. A keystone of quartz-shot granite above the arch. The back wall, solid bedrock, no seepage, no fractures. Side walls, the same, carved from living rock. The roof was gone, beyond repair, would need to be rebuilt entirely. The doorway lintel had fallen but could be reset. The window frame was rotted through, would need replacing. The interior was choked with 15 years of accumulated debris. It was, by any reasonable measure, a ruin, a place no sensible person would choose to live. A worthless mining claim on the highest ridge above a small Colorado town, a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale. Wren Calloway looked at it the way her grandfather had taught her to look at a rough quarried block of granite, not at what it was, but at what it could become. The stone was true. The foundation was sound. Everything else was work. She knew how to work. She turned her back on the dugout, faced south, began the descent toward Sulfur Flats. Her steps were different now, lighter, more deliberate, carrying a purpose that had crystallized during the night like frost on a wool blanket. She was not going down to seek help, to ask for charity, to throw herself on the mercy of a town that had watched her be discarded without lifting a hand to stop it. She was going down to conduct a transaction, to buy something no one else wanted, to begin. The town appeared below her through the thinning trees, its rooftops catching the mid-morning sun. The railroad depot, the general store, the white steeple of the church, the clapboard building that housed the administrative offices of the county. She walked toward it with the focused calm of someone who has made a decision so deep it has become indistinguishable from who they are, not a choice anymore, but an identity. She reached the administrative building, pushed open the door, stepped inside. Enfield looked up from his paperwork. She placed the coin on the counter. "I want to purchase the deed to the Mercer Stake on Harrow Ridge." The rest, the signing, the counting of coins, the walk back out into the April sunlight, you already know. What you do not know yet is what waited for her when she returned to that dugout. what she would find sealed behind a loose stone in the hearth that Obadiah Mercer had built with the same patient, precise hands that had built everything else in that small, solid room on the top of the world. But that is for later. For now, she stood on the wooden sidewalk of Sulfur Flats, Colorado, the deed folded against her chest, $2 in her pocket, the fossil stone pressing its familiar weight against her thigh. She looked north toward the mountains, toward Harrow Ridge, toward the place that the whole town called worthless, the place that she alone could see for what it truly was. She began to walk. The climb back up felt different. It was no longer a flight but a homecoming. She carried the deed against her skin, the paper warm from her body heat, the ink of her own name drying into permanence with every step. The trail that had been a path of escape 2 days ago was now a road to something she owned, a word that tasted unfamiliar in her mouth. Except she had to keep tests against the reality of her situation to make sure it held. Owner, she owned something. A piece of the mountain itself deeded to her, recorded in the county ledger in Enfield's careful handwriting. It was hers in a way that nothing had ever been hers before, not granted, not inherited, not given out of obligation or pity, but chosen, purchased with money she had counted out coin by coin onto a scarred wooden counter. The afternoon sun threw long columns of light through the ponderosa pines as she climbed, each shaft illuminating a small circle of forest floor, a patch of needles, a scatter of pine cones, a section of exposed root gripping the earth like the fingers of a buried hand. She moved through these pools of light with steady, deliberate steps, her breathing finding the rhythm of the ascent. The $2 remaining in the pouch at her waist felt lighter than the 15 she had spent. Money kept was weight. Money spent on the right thing was freedom. When she reached the dugout in the late afternoon, the shadow of the ridge had already swallowed the eastern face, casting the structure into a blue-gray twilight that softened its ruin, hid the worst of the damage, made it look almost intentional, an old structure, choosing to rest rather than a broken one failing to stand. She dropped her bundle beside the entrance, then stood for a moment looking at what she had bought. The first task was the entrance. The fallen lintel, a slab of granite as long as her arm span, thick as her thigh, blocked the doorway at a steep angle. She could not lift it. No single person could. But Cormac had taught her that strength was not the only way to move stone. Leverage was the mason's oldest tool, older than the hammer, older than the chisel. She found a stout pine branch, thick as her wrist, still green enough to flex without snapping. She cleared the dirt from around the lintel's base, working with her hands, scraping with a flat piece of shale she pulled from the rubble. She positioned a smaller rock as a fulcrum, choosing it the way Cormac would have, looking for flat surfaces on both top, bottom, a stone that would bear weight without rolling. She set the branch, leaned into it with her full body weight, felt the resistance, adjusted the fulcrum an inch closer, leaned again. The lintel shifted. A scraping sound, stone against stone, the complaint of something that had been settled for 15 years, being asked to move. 30 minutes of this patient, painstaking work, adjust, lever, shift until the doorway was clear enough to pass through. She stepped inside. The air was different, cool, still, carrying the mineral scent of stone that has not been exposed to open wind for years, a smell like the inside of a cave, like the deep places of the earth where time moves slower. The floor was a mound of debris from the collapsed roof. She could see the dimensions of the room now, roughly 12 feet square, the back wall solid bedrock with a slight natural curve, the side walls carved from the mountain's living rock with tools that had left faint parallel grooves in the surface, the signature of a point chisel driven by a steady hand. At the rear of the room, dominating the space, was the hearth. It was massive, built of stones chosen for their size, their flatness, the way they fit together, without need for excess mortar. The firebox was deep, nearly 3 feet, lined with stones that showed the soot stains of 1,000 fires. The arch above the firebox was a semicircle of carefully shaped wedge stones, each one bearing the weight of the one beside it. At the crown of the arch sat the keystone, a perfect wedge of quartz-shot granite, its surface catching the dim light, tiny flecks of quartz glittering like trapped stars. Obadiah Mercer had built this hearth not merely to function but to endure, to be the last thing standing if everything else fell away, which was exactly what had happened. She spent the rest of that day clearing debris from the interior, working with her hands, the flat shale, the wool blanket pressed into service as a makeshift drag, loading it with dirt, rotted wood, broken stones, hauling each load to the edge of the slope outside, dumping it, returning for more. It was exhausting, dirty, monotonous labor. The kind of work that breaks some people because it offers no drama, no climax, no moment of triumph, just the slow grinding accumulation of small efforts that are individually meaningless but collectively transformative. By nightfall, she had cleared enough of the floor to sleep inside. She built a small fire in the hearth carefully, testing the draw of the chimney first with a handful of dry pine needles, watching the smoke rise straight up through the flue without hesitation, the chimney performing its function, after 15 years of dormancy, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The fire caught, grew, filled the small space with warmth, with the smell of pine smoke, with a flickering orange light that danced across the stone walls, bringing them to life. She ate the last of the food. She had a handful of dried beans softened over the fire in the tin canteen. Not a meal, a gesture toward sustenance. She lay on the cleared section of floor, the wool blanket wrapped tight around her, the fire crackling in the hearth, the fossil stone pressing its familiar weight against her thigh. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, the way a person sleeps when they have come to the end of something terrible, the beginning of something unknown. The next morning she continued clearing the interior. Beneath the rotted roof timbers, she found the original floor, not dirt as she had expected, but flat stones laid in a tight pattern, fitted together with the same meticulous care that characterized everything else Mercer had built. It was while she was clearing the hearthstones at the base of the firebox that she saw it. One of the stones, a flat, squarish piece of slate positioned to the right of the firebox opening, was different. Not the stone itself, which was unremarkable, the same gray-blue slate found throughout these mountains. The difference was in the joint. While the stones around it were sealed with a hardened mixture of clay, lime, the mortar set so firm it was indistinguishable from the stone itself. This one was bedded in dry, packed dirt. It was a subtle difference, the kind of thing that a casual observer would walk past 1,000 times without noticing, the kind of thing that required a specific education to see. Wren had that education. She knew the look of a proper joint, the way a musician knows the sound of a properly tuned string. This joint was wrong, not carelessly wrong, deliberately wrong. Someone had removed this stone, then replaced it, using a packing material that could be easily removed again. It was a door disguised as a wall. Her pulse quickened. She remembered Cormac tapping on walls, listening for the hollow sound that betrayed a cavity behind the surface. A wall should speak with one voice. When one stone speaks differently, it's telling you something the builder didn't want everyone to hear. She knelt before the hearth, tapped the stone with the handle of her chipping hammer. The stones around it responded with the solid thud of mass backed by mass. The slate responded with a sound that was subtly, unmistakably different. A dull, slightly hollow note, the sound of a space behind. She reversed the hammer, used the sharp end to chip at the packed dirt in the seam. It crumbled easily, too easily for natural mortar, confirming what she already knew. After 10 minutes, she could fit her fingertips into the seam. The stone was heavy, perhaps 30 pounds, but it shifted when she pulled. She worked it back forth, loosening it until the stone came free entirely. Behind it was a rectangular cavity, roughly the size of a small bread box, carved into the bedrock with the same point chisel that had shaped the walls. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oilskin that was still intact despite the years, was a metal box. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. An ammunition box, the kind used by the military, heavy for its size, its metal cool. There was no lock, only a simple latch. She set the box on the hearthstone in front of her. The fire she had built that morning was still burning, casting a warm light over the metal surface, over her hands, over the moment that was about to split her life into before-after. She lifted the latch. The lid opened with a soft metallic groan. Inside, the contents were packed with meticulous care, the care of someone who had arranged these objects knowing they would not be seen again in his lifetime. On top lay a small carved bird, a simple thing, no larger than her thumb, whittled from a piece of pine that had aged to a pale honey color. The bird's wings were folded against its body, its head slightly tilted, as if listening for something. Its surface was worn smooth, the soft, persistent friction of a child's hand holding it, turning it, carrying it everywhere, the way children carry the objects they love, wearing them down to silk with the unconscious devotion of constant touch. Beneath the bird lay a letter, several pages folded together, tied with a piece of hemp twine that had gone brittle with age. The paper was dry, the ink faded from black to a brownish sepia, but the handwriting was clear, strong, deliberate strokes made by a hand accustomed to gripping tools heavier than a pen. Beneath the letter, filling the remainder of the box, were coins, not a few coins tossed carelessly into a container, but stacks of them, neatly wrapped in paper rolls arranged in rows, silver dollars, gold eagles, double eagles. The paper wrappers were labeled in the same handwriting as the letter amounts, dates, neat columns of figures that told the story of years of saving. She set the box down with careful hands, reached for the letter, untied the brittle twine, unfolded the pages. The paper crackled softly, the sound of something old being opened, a message sent across 15 years of silence finally reaching its intended recipient. She began to read. To whomever finds this place and has need of it, my name is Obadiah Mercer. I built this dugout in the year 1869. I came to these mountains with my wife, Constance, and our daughter Rosie, seeking gold. We found a little enough to live on, but not the fortune we dreamed of. It was a hard life, but a good one. This ridge was our home. In the winter of 1871, the fever came through the valley. It took Constance first, then it took my Rosie. She was 6 years old. The bird in this box was hers. I carved it for her from a piece of pine the winter she turned 4. She kept it with her always. After they were gone, the world lost its color. The gold in the rock meant nothing to me anymore. I stopped digging for it. I started building with the stone instead. I built this place not as a mine but as a shelter, a place to be quiet with my grief. I lived here for 11 more years after they passed. The money in this box is what I saved over my lifetime. It is 840, not a king's ransom but an honest sum, earned with my own 2 hands. I have no kin to leave it to. I am an old man now and my time is short. I will go down to the town and live out my last days, but my heart will remain here on this mountain with them. I do not know who you are or what brought you to this lonely place. Perhaps you are running from something. Perhaps you are running towards something. It does not matter. What matters is that you are here. This place kept me safe. It gave me peace when I thought there was none left in the world. My hope is that it can do the same for you. Use the money to make it a home again. Buy timber for the roof, a pane of glass for the window, a proper door to keep out the winter wind. There is good water in the spring, 100 yards east. The hunting is fair. It is a good place to live for someone who is not afraid of and their own company. All I ask is that you care for it, that sometimes you remember Obadiah, Constance, and little Rosie Mercer, who lived and loved on this mountain. May you find your peace here. Obadiah Mercer, 1882. Wren read the letter twice, the first time with her mind, absorbing the facts, the dates, the money, the instructions. The second time with something deeper than her mind, something that lived in the place below thought, below language, the place where grief recognizes grief across the distance of years, across the gulf between the living, the dead. The words blurred, she blinked, felt the wetness on her cheeks before she understood what was happening. These were the first tears she had allowed herself since May died. Not tears of self-pity. She did not have that in her. Had never had it, had been built by Cormac out of sterner material. These were tears of recognition, of being seen by someone who could not see her, known by someone who could not know her. A man she had never met, dead before she was old enough to remember, had reached across 15 years of silence to tell her, "You are not alone. Someone was here before you. Someone knew what it was to lose everything, to be left with nothing but stone, silence, the slow work of rebuilding a life from the ruins of the one that had been taken away. She sat on the hearthstone for a long time after that. The fire burned low beside her. She held the wooden bird in her palm. It was small, so small that a child's hand had been enough to polish it smooth over 2 years of constant holding. She thought of the girl who had owned it. She thought of the girl who had owned it, a girl whose name she now knew, whose favorite thing in the world had been this tiny carved bird that fit in the palm of a hand. She thought of Cormac's fossil stone in her pocket, another object worn smooth by touch, another memory held inside something hard enough to carry it. She placed the bird back in the box, placed the letter beside it, did not count the coins that could wait. She slid the slate back into its cavity, pressed the edges firm with packed dirt, restored the hiding place to its original appearance. Then she sat before the cold hearth, watching the last light of day fade from the window opening, the sky turning from blue to violet to the deep, star-scattered black of a mountain night. She was no longer a girl who had been cast out. She was the inheritor of a trust. The ghost of Obadiah Mercer had given her something more valuable than $840. He had given her a foundation not of stone, though that too, but of purpose, a reason to build, a story to continue, a debt of care to repay to a man she would never meet, for a kindness he had offered to a stranger he would never know. The next morning she rose with a focused energy that burned clean, steady, like a well-built fire in a well-built hearth. She secured the metal box in its hiding place, took a $20 gold piece from the stacks, tucked it into the pouch at her waist, began the descent to Sulfur Flats. This time she walked differently, not as an outcast, not as a girl who had been discarded, as a property owner with business to conduct. Her first stop was the general store. Virgil Coombs was behind the counter, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a pencil tucked behind his right ear, his face the weathered map of a man who had spent 30 years selling goods to miners, ranchers, drifters. He recognized Wren the moment she walked through the door. Looking for work. His voice carried neither pity nor mockery, only the neutral curiosity of a businessman assessing a potential transaction. "No, sir, I'm here to buy." She placed a list on the counter. He picked it up, read it, his eyebrows climbing his forehead as he absorbed the contents: a felling axe, full-size, steel head, a 2-man crosscut saw, 5 feet, a broad axe for hewing, an adze, a draw knife, 20 pounds of cut nails assorted, 1 sack of flour, 50 pounds, beans, 20 pounds, salt, 5 pounds, coffee, 3 pounds. It was not the list of a girl looking for a handout. It was the list of someone planning to build something, to stay somewhere, to make a permanent claim on a piece of the world. Coombs had been in business long enough to read a person's intentions from their supply order, the way a doctor reads sleep symptoms. The axe said timber, the crosscut saw said heavy construction, the draw knife said precision work, the food said months of self-sufficiency. "Costly bill of goods, miss." His eyes moved from the list to her worn clothes, her calloused hands, her face that was too young for the steadiness it carried. "I can pay." She placed the gold eagle on the counter. It landed with a sound that was different from the stayed. It landed with a sound her $15 had made on Enfield's counter the day before, heavier, warmer, the sound of possibility rather than desperation. Coombs picked it up, turned it once, tested the weight by instinct, set it down with a nod that contained more respect than any word he could have spoken. He began gathering her items without further comment. While he worked, the door opened. A large man entered, not tall so much as wide, built like something assembled from oak planks, rope, iron fittings. Thaddeus Briggs, freighter. He ran a train of mules into the high country mining camps, hauling supplies up trails too steep for wagons. He was 45 years old, quiet in the way that large men are sometimes quiet, not from shyness, but from the understanding that a person his size did not need volume to command attention. He nodded to Coombs, glanced at the pile of goods accumulating on the counter, glanced at Wren. Coombs saw the opportunity with the practiced instinct of a man who had spent his career connecting needs with solutions. "Thad, this young lady just purchased a heavy load." heading up to the old Mercer place on Harrow Ridge. Imagine she'll need a way to get this gear up there. Briggs' movement stopped. His hand, which had been reaching for a tin of tobacco on the shelf behind him, paused in midair. The name had done something to him, not dramatically, but Wren was not a casual observer. She had been trained to notice the small things, the subtle shifts. "You bought the Mercer Stake?" His voice was a low rumble, the verbal equivalent of distant thunder. "Signed the deed yesterday." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, each word laid down with the care of a man who does not waste them. "I know the trail up there. I ran freight to Mercer in 7071, before he lost his family." A pause. "He was a decent man. Paid fair. Treated me like a person, not a pack animal. Not everyone did." Another pause. He looked at the pile of tools, at her small frame, at the mountain that loomed invisible beyond the store's walls. "I'll haul your gear up, $2 for the trip." A fair price, they both knew it. Then quieter, "I'll stay on a week. Help you raise the roof beams. No charge for that. Call it a debt I owe a dead man." Wren studied him the way she studied stone, looking for the hidden grain, the fracture line, the place where the surface might not match what lay beneath. She found nothing false. This was a man offering help because he had a reason that mattered to him, a reason rooted in something real, something owed, not charity, not pity, a debt. Accepted. While Briggs went to prepare his mules, Wren made one more stop. The small office of Doc Pruitt, town physician, a man of 68, whose hands still held the steadiness of a surgeon, despite the tremor that age had introduced into everything else. She bought a medical kit from him: bandages, carbolic salve, a small bottle of laudanum for pain, a surgical needle with catgut thread, a bottle of quinine. He wrapped the items in brown paper, tied the package with string, looked at her over his spectacles with an expression she could not quite read: concern, perhaps, or a kind of professional respect for someone who understood that preparation was not pessimism, but responsibility. "Winters are hard up there," he said, his voice gruff, the gruffness of a man who cared more than he wanted to show. "A body needs to be prepared." She thanked him, paid, left. When she returned to Coombs' store, 3 sturdy mules stood outside, packed, balanced, ready, their loads lashed down with the expert efficiency of a man who had been doing this work since before Wren was born. The journey up was slow, careful, Briggs leading the animals, Wren walking alongside, both of them reading the trail for the hazards that mountain paths conceal beneath their apparent simplicity. They did not speak much. Neither of them was inclined toward conversation for its own sake. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but functional, the silence of two people focused on the same task, communicating through gesture, through the tilt of a head toward a hazard, through the raised hand that meant stop. "Let me check this section first." When they reached the dugout, Briggs stood before it for a long time. His eyes moved over the stonework, the chimney, the collapsed roof. Whatever he was seeing, it was not only the present. He was seeing it as it had been when Obadiah Mercer was alive, when smoke rose from that chimney, when a man's grief lived inside those walls like a fire that never quite went out. He built well. That was all, he said. It was enough. They unloaded the mules, stacked the supplies inside the dugout, against the wall, out of the weather. Briggs unhitched his animals, let them graze on the sparse alpine grass. Then he picked up the felling axe, tested its weight, ran his thumb along the factory-sharp edge. "Good axe. Let's find some good trees." What followed was a week unlike anything Wren had experienced, a partnership forged not through words or agreement, but through the shared language of physical labor, the grammar of sawdust, sweat, stone. They worked from the moment the sun cleared the eastern ridge until it dropped behind the western peaks. Wren showed Briggs which pines to cut. She sighted them the way Cormac had taught her to sight, a stone looking for the grain, the internal structure. She chose 10 lodgepole pines, each one straight as a surveyor's rod, free of the spiral grain that could cause a log to twist as it cured. She marked each one with a blaze of the axe at chest height, then stepped back to calculate the fall line. They worked the crosscut saw together. The rhythm of the crosscut is a rhythm unlike any other. Each a person pulls, never pushes. the blade traveling back-forth, eating into the wood with a sound like a long, sustained exhalation. It requires coordination that cannot be forced. Only found, the two bodies must synchronize, must breathe together, must surrender the individual ego to the shared task. Wren pulled. Briggs pulled. The saw sang its note into the mountain silence. 10 trees fell in 4 days. They limbed them where they lay, stripped the branches with axe, draw knife, leaving clean logs that smelled of fresh pine, their cut ends weeping sap like golden tears. Briggs hitched the mules to the logs, dragged them to the dugout one by one. The most dangerous part was the ridgepole. This was the spine of the roof, a single log, 30 feet long, that would rest atop the front wall on one end, on a notched support at the back wall on the other. Everything else would hang from it. If the ridgepole was not straight, not strong, not properly seated, nothing above it would be true. They built a ramp of earth, rocks, stacked logs. They rigged ropes around the ridgepole, ran them over the wall, hitched them to the mules on the far side. Wren stood at the base of the ramp, guiding the log, keeping it aligned with the notches she had spent an entire afternoon carving into the wall's top course notches, measured with Cormac's boxwood rule, to tolerances that made Briggs raise an eyebrow. The mules pulled. The ropes creaked. The log began to move up the ramp, its weight enormous, its progress agonizingly slow. Wren used a short lever to keep the butt end on track, her muscles screaming with the effort. Briggs stood at the top of the ramp, his hands on the log, his legs braced, absorbing the shocks as the timber lurched upward. One slip could bring the entire weight crashing down. The log reached the top, teetered. For one sickening moment it rocked on the wall's edge, balanced between going forward into the notch, falling backward down the ramp. Briggs threw his weight against it. Wren drove her lever into the base. The log tipped forward, slid into the carved notch, with a sound that was deep, resonant, final, the sound of a key turning in a lock, of something finding the place it was meant to occupy. They stood there, breathing hard, sweat running despite the mountain cold. No words passed between them. None were needed. Briggs gave a slow nod, the kind of nod that contains, in its brevity, everything that needs to be said about shared effort, shared risk, shared accomplishment. He stayed 3 more days after that. Together they set the rafters, smaller logs, notched at each end. His raw strength, guided by her precise instructions, moved through the work with an efficiency that surprised them both. On the morning he left, he hitched his mules, tightened the pack straps, then stood for a moment at the trailhead, looking back at the dugout with its skeleton of new rafters rising above the old stone walls. A woman living this high up ought to have a solid roof over her head. His voice carried no sentimentality. It was a statement of practical fact. He turned, led his mules down the switchback trail, disappeared into the trees without looking back. Wren watched him go. Then she picked up the adze, turned to the nearest rafter, began to flatten its top surface for the decking that would come next. The sound of the blade biting into green pine echoed off the rock face. Behind the dugout, the sound of a woman building her own shelter, one stroke at a time. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of labor so consuming that time itself seemed to change its nature. The hours were not empty containers to be filled, but full vessels, to be carried, each one weighted with purpose, with the satisfying exhaustion of muscles used to their limit, with the visible, measurable progress of a structure emerging from chaos. She flattened the rafter tops with the adze, split smaller logs for decking, laying the halves flat side up across the rafters, laid a thick layer of pine boughs over the decking, the first layer of insulation, fragrant, springy, still green. Then she cut thick squares of alpine turf from the meadow east of the ridge, heavy, root-bound blocks of earth. Grass, wildflowers, laid them grass side down on the pine boughs, followed by a second layer grass side up. The roof, when finished, looked as if it had grown there, a thick green living surface that blended seamlessly with the mountain slope above. She built a door from thick planks using wooden pegs where she could, iron hinges from Coombs' store where she could not. For the window, She built a sturdy frame of pine, mortised at the corners, fitted with the pane of glass she had bought on her second trip down to Sulfur Flats. Real glass, clear, smooth, letting in the mountain light without the diffusion of oiled canvas. The first time she stood inside the dugout, looking out through that glass at the canyon, spread below, the valley, the distant thread of the railroad, she felt something shift in her chest, a settling, a rightness, the feeling of a stone finding its notch. She sealed the gaps between the interior stones with clay mixed with dried grass, built shelves into the natural irregularities of the rock walls, a small sturdy table, a three-legged stool, crafted from leftover pine. One afternoon, as she was fitting the door into its frame, planing the edge with the draw knife to get the swing just right, she heard hoofbeats on the trail below. Hattie Drummond came around the last switchback on a gray mare, a large basket tied to the saddle behind her. She dismounted with the ease of a woman who had ridden horses her entire life, tied the mare to a pine stump, stood looking at the dugout, with an expression that moved through surprise into something warmer, something closer to recognition. Thaddeus Briggs told me a girl was building a home on the summit. Her smile was genuine, unguarded, the smile of someone who had nothing to gain from kindness except the kindness itself. I thought you might appreciate a meal you didn't have to cook yourself. Inside the basket, a roasted chicken, golden-skinned, still warm. A loaf of bread, the crust dark, crackling. A jar of apple butter, the glass catching the afternoon light. A small pie, its top latticed, the filling a deep amber that smelled of cinnamon, nutmeg, the concentrated sweetness of fruit, preserved against winter. It was the kindest gesture anyone had directed at Wren since Cormac had placed the fossil stone in her palm by the creek. She stood holding the basket, with both hands, unable to speak for a moment because the generosity of it, the sheer, uncomplicated goodness of a person bringing food to a stranger on a mountain, had caught her off guard, had found a crack in the armor she had built around herself, had reached something inside that she had thought was safely sealed away. They sat on a fallen log outside the dugout, the basket between them, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces. They ate in the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to perform for each other. Then, gradually, Wren began to talk. She told Hattie about Cormac, about the quarry, about the way he could look at a block of raw granite, see inside it the shape of the finished stone, the wall it would become. She told her about May, the bread, the songs, the warmth that had gone out of the house when she died. She did not tell her about the box in the hearth. That was not hers to share, not yet. Maybe not ever, but she told her enough. Hattie in turn told Wren about Obadiah Mercer. She remembered him not well. She was a girl when he came down from the mountain for the last time, but her mother had run the boarding house before her, had given Mercer a room in the last years of his life. He had been a sad, quiet old man who kept to himself, who paid his rent on time, who sat on the boarding house porch in the evenings staring north toward Harrow Ridge. People thought he was strange. Hattie's voice carried a particular tenderness. But my mother always said he was just a man with a broken heart. That visit was the first of many. The community that had watched Wren be cast out was now reaching up to her one person at a time. Not as a collective act of conscience, but as individual gestures, made by individual people for their own individual reasons. Doc Pruitt climbed up one afternoon, ostensibly to check on a sheep herder in a nearby valley. He stopped at the dugout, accepted a cup of coffee, sat on the three-legged stool Wren had built, looked around the room with the assessing eye of a man whose profession was the identification of things that could go wrong. Solid work, he said, which, from a man of his temperament, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. He left a bottle of quinine on the shelf. Briggs made it a habit leave a bundle of newspapers, the occasional letter from Hattie, at the base of the trail whenever his freight route took him past Sulfur Flats. He did not climb up, did not want to intrude on whatever the young woman was building up there. Not just the physical structure, but the internal one, the architecture of self-reliance that required solitude the way stone required pressure to become something harder than it was before. She was no longer Wren Calloway, the orphan, the outcast, the girl who had been given $17 to go away. She was becoming something else, a person defined not by what had been taken from her, but by what she was constructing in its place. People in Sulfur Flats began to speak of her with a grudging admiration that had nothing to do with sentiment. They called her place Calloway Hold. They used the word the way they used words for natural features of the landscape, not as a description, but as a name, a fixed point, a thing that existed because it had proven itself capable of existing. As autumn came to Harrow Ridge, the aspens in the canyons below turning gold, the scrub oak going orange, the sky deepening to a blue so intense it looked painted, the dugout completed its transformation. What had been a ruin 4 months ago was now a home. Solid, warm, fitted to the mountain as naturally as the rock formations that surrounded it. Inside, each object had its place. Each surface had been thought about, planned, executed with the deliberate attention of someone who believed that the quality of a life was reflected in the quality of the spaces it was lived in. The shelves were level. The table was square. The door swung true. She had built a bed frame in the far corner, a simple platform of pine, its joints pegged, its surface smoothed with the drawknife. The mattress was pine boughs, replaced weekly. On the shelf beside the bed, 2 objects sat side by side. The fossil stone gray-blue smooth, the fern imprint as sharp as the day Cormac had placed it in her hand. The wooden bird honey-colored pine, worn silk smooth by a child's touch, its head tilted as if listening for something it would never hear again. 2 relics of 2 different lives, 2 different griefs, now joined in a single small warm room on the top of a mountain in Colorado, kept by a woman who was the inheritor of both their stories. The first snow of the season fell in late October, fat, silent flakes drifting down past the new glass window, each one catching the firelight for an instant before settling onto the dark ground outside. Wren sat at her table mending a tear in her shirt, the needle moving through the fabric with the same patient, precise rhythm she brought to every task. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, shifting light across the room. The coffee on the stove filled the air with its bitter, comforting smell. She looked up from her work, looked at the bird on the shelf, the stone beside it. 2 objects that should never have met. One from a quarry west of Sulfur Flats, the other from a ridge above it, now resting together, as if they had always belonged in each other's company. She thought of Cormac, his rough hands gentle on the face of a stone. She thought of Obadiah, his strong handwriting spelling out a hope he had no reason to believe would be fulfilled. Both men had understood something that Garrett Calloway, for all his ledgers, had never grasped. That the things worth building are the things that outlast you. That the truest measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you leave behind for someone you will never meet. The snow fell harder. The fire burned steady. The first deep winter was coming. Wren Calloway was ready for it. The snow fell for 3 days without pause. Not the dramatic wind-driven blizzard of dime novels, no howling gales, no horizontal sheets of ice, no theatrical fury. This was something quieter, more absolute, a silent, steady accumulation that erased the world. 1 layer at a time, the way a painter covers an old canvas with white primer, obliterating what was beneath until nothing remained but blankness. The sharp edges of the granite outcroppings softened into mounds. The gnarled pines bent under cloaks of white, so heavy their branches touched the ground. The trails disappeared. The canyon below vanished into a gray-white void that could have been 10 feet deep, or 10,000 distance itself had been abolished, replaced by a featureless curtain that made the universe feel very small, no larger than the 12-foot room where Wren Calloway sat watching it through a glass window. Inside Calloway Hold, the world was different. The hearth drew perfectly, its fire a living thing that breathed in rhythm, with the draft inhaling the cold air that seeped through invisible gaps in the stone, exhaling warmth that radiated from the hearthstones into the floor, the walls, the bed frame. The smell of pine smoke layered over coffee, over the venison stew she had simmering in the iron pot she'd bought from Coombs on her last trip down, over the subtle mineral scent of the stone walls themselves, a smell like the inside of the earth, like permanence. She had spent the autumn preparing for this moment, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that winter at 9,000 feet was not a season but a siege. The firewood was stacked in a long, tight rick against the east wall-split pine, cured for 3 months. She had calculated the amount she would need based on the size of the hearth, the volume of the room, the average number of hours between sunset in November, sunrise in March. She had cut 20% more than her estimate. Margin was not waste. Margin was wisdom. The shelves held their inventory with orderly precision. Flour in its canvas sack, secured with twine. Beans beside it. Salt in the tin. Coffee in the cloth bag. Jars of dried berries she had gathered in September, huckleberries. Chokecherries, each jar sealed with wax, labeled in her careful handwriting. Strips of venison, salted, dried, stored in a wooden box she had crafted from leftover planking. She had everything she needed. She did not need Sulfur Flats. She did not need Garrett. She did not need Vivian's $17, which had been spent months ago on the deed that now resided in a tin box on the top shelf. She needed nothing from anyone. The fire was burning. The food was stored. The roof was holding. The walls were true. She was entirely alone on the top of a mountain in a snowstorm, cut off from every other human being by 1,000 vertical feet of snow-covered trail. She had never felt more at peace. The long winter days were full of the slow, meticulous work that Cormac had taught her to love. She took his boxwood rule from the shelf, unfolded it on the table, began to design. A more intricate set of shelves for the west wall, with dovetail joints instead of the simple butt joints she had used for the first set. A small cabinet with a hinged door. A new chair, the 3-legged stool, had served its purpose, but her back ached after long evenings. She drew the designs on the backs of old newspapers Briggs had left for her, using a pencil stub she had found in the pocket of Cormac's jacket. She worked on the furniture through the winter months, using the pine she had cured. The drawknife peeled long, fragrant curls from the plank surfaces. The chisel cut dovetails with a precision that improved with each joint. The first few were tight but slightly uneven, the later ones fitting together with a smoothness that produced a small click of satisfaction when she tapped them home. Each completed piece was a small victory against formlessness. Each perfectly fitted joint was an argument against the idea that the world was a random, chaotic place where things fell apart for no reason. Things fell apart when they were built wrong, when they were built right, with attention, with patience, with the understanding that every detail mattered even when no one was watching. They held. It was during one of these long winter evenings, mid-December, the fire burning low, the wind outside making a sound like someone humming a note too deep for words, that she noticed the envelope. It was tucked between the pages of a 3-month-old newspaper from Denver, one of the bundle Briggs had left at the base of the trail a week before the big snow. She had been reading the paper slowly, rationing the words the way she rationed everything else. An article about a railroad expansion in the San Luis Valley. A notice about a meeting of the Colorado State Legislature. An advertisement for a patent medicines that promised to cure everything from rheumatism to melancholy. Then, between pages 4-5, a white envelope, unsealed, her name, written on the front, in a hand she recognized immediately, Garrett Calloway's handwriting. Small, precise, letters formed with the careful regularity of a man who had spent his life writing figures in ledgers. She held the envelope in both hands. The firelight caught the white paper, made it glow. She did not open it. She placed it on the table, centered it precisely, the way she centered a stone before checking it with the plumb bob. She stared at it for a long time. The fire shifted, a log settling deeper into the coals with a soft collapse that sent a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. She stood, walked to the shelf, took down the tin box where she kept the deed, placed the envelope inside, beside the deed, closed the lid, returned the box to the shelf. Then she sat down at the table, picked up the drawknife, returned to the chair leg she had been shaping. Not tonight. The envelope would keep. She was not refusing the letter. She was not destroying it. She was placing it where she placed all the important things in her life, in a secure location, protected, waiting until the time was right. 3 days later she opened it. The letter was written, on a single sheet of good paper-heavy stock, the kind used for formal correspondence. The ink was dark, fresh, the writing more careful than Garrett's usual hand, as if he had taken extra time with each word, as if he knew that these particular words would be read more closely than anything he had ever written in his ledgers. He did not apologize. That was the first thing she noticed. Garrett Calloway did not have that vocabulary. The words existed in the English language, but not in the particular dialect of emotional restraint that he had spoken his entire life. What he wrote instead was something she had not expected. He wrote about May. He wrote about the way she used to hum while she worked in the kitchen, a tuneless, meandering melody that had no beginning or end but simply existed as a continuous presence, the way sunlight exists, the way air exists, a thing so constant you do not notice it until it stops. He wrote about the first time he saw her at a church social in Sulfur Flats in the spring of '64, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, her laugh carrying across the room to where he stood by the punch bowl, too shy to approach, too captivated to leave. He wrote about the morning Wren was born, how May had held the infant against her chest, exhausted, radiant, her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, her face communicating everything that words would only diminish. He wrote about Cormac. This surprised Wren more than anything else in the letter. "Your grandfather always made me feel small," Garrett had written, "not because he tried to, because he was right about things I was too afraid to face. He understood what mattered. I understood what balanced. Those are not the same thing, and I spent too many years pretending they were." Near the end, a single sentence that stopped her breath. "I hear you are building something on Harrow Ridge." Cormac would have been proud. Not I am proud. He did not claim that for himself, did not presume that his pride, after what he had done, would mean anything to her. He gave the pride to Cormac, the one person whose approval Wren had always sought, the one person whose judgment she trusted without reservation. It was, she realized, the most honest thing Garrett Calloway had ever communicated to her. Not an apology which would have been easy, cheap, a coin tossed onto a counter to settle a debt that could not be settled with money, but an acknowledgement. He saw now what he had failed to see then. Whether that seeing had come too late to matter was a question the letter did not try to answer. Wren sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. The fire had burned down to embers. Written. She thought about the man who had written these words, not the man who had sat in the parlor with white knuckles while Vivienne pushed a pouch of coins across the table, but the man who had once stood by a punch bowl, too shy to speak to a woman in a blue dress. Both men existed inside Garrett Calloway. Both were real. The question was not which one was the true Garrett they both were, but which one she was willing to remember. She folded the letter, placed it back in the tin box beside the deed. Then she took a sheet of newspaper, tore a clean margin from the edge, sharpened her pencil, wrote 5 words. "I'm all right. Roof holds. W." She left it at the base of the trail the next time she went to collect Briggs' newspaper bundle, weighted down with a stone so the wind would not take it. She did not know if it would reach Garrett. She did not know if she wanted it to. But she had written it, sent it. But she had written it, sent it, allowed the thinnest possible thread to remain stretched between herself, the man who had fathered her. Not forgiveness, she was not there yet, might never be. Not reconciliation, just a thread. A single, slender filament of connection, fragile as spider silk, strong as the catgut she used to mend torn flesh. Enough to say, "I exist. I am not what you left me to become. I am something else entirely." February brought the worst of the winter. The temperature dropped to levels she had not imagined possible, cold so severe that the water in her canteen froze solid overnight, despite sitting 3 feet from the hearth, cold that turned the sap in the firewood to ice, making the logs pop, crack like gunshots when the flames reached the frozen pockets inside. The air outside was a weapon. She could feel it attacking exposed skin. The moment she opened the door, a burning sensation that was the opposite of heat, but produced the same damage. She went out to check her trapline on a morning when the sky was the color of old pewter, featureless, heavy with the promise of more snow. The traps were set along the ridge to the north rabbit snares. Mostly, it was a 30-minute walk each way, a route so familiar she could have followed it blindfolded. The wind hit her on the exposed section of the ridge, a sustained gale from the northwest that drove ice crystals into her face like flung sand. She pulled Cormac's jacket tighter, tucked her chin into the collar, pushed forward. She checked 3 snares empty, the rabbits too deep in their burrows to venture out in this cold. She turned back. By the time she reached the dugout, something was wrong inside her body. A heaviness in her limbs that was more than exhaustion. A thickness in her throat that was more than cold. A burning behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the wind. The fever came on fast. By evening she was shivering beneath the wool blanket, despite the fire being built to its maximum. Her teeth chattered so violently she could hear them, a rapid clicking that sounded like the death rattle of something small. Trapped, desperate, she knew what this was. She had watched May die of something similar. The memory rose in her unbidden, unwanted. She pushed it down. She could not afford that memory right now. She needed to act methodically, practically, without the luxury of fear. She got the quinine from the medical kit, measured a dose by the light of the fire, her hands trembling so badly that the bottle clinked against the cup like a small bell. She swallowed the bitter liquid, gagged, swallowed again. She made broth from salted venison, forcing herself to drink it despite the nausea. She built the fire higher, fed it the largest logs she had, knowing she would pay for the extravagance later when the woodpile was shorter, but needing the heat now, desperately. The first night was the worst. She lay on the bed, curled tight, the blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon, the fire blazing, her body producing heat, burning through it, producing more. In the deepest trough of the fever, somewhere in the hours between midnight, dawn, she heard Cormac's hammer, not as a memory, as a sound, present, real, the steady tap-tap-tap of steel on granite, rhythmic as a heartbeat, coming from somewhere just outside the wall, just beyond the stone, just past the edge of consciousness. She knew it was not real. She held on to it anyway. The second day, she could not stand. She crawled to the hearth, fed the fire from a pile of kindling she had been wise enough to stack within arm's reach of the bed. She drank water from the canteen, ate nothing. The third day, the fever broke. She woke with the sudden clarity that comes after a prolonged illness, the world snapping back into focus as if someone had cleaned a fogged window. The stone walls, the shelf, the bird, the fossil stone, the fire, which had burned down to a bed of gray ash with a single coal glowing red at the center, a stubborn ember that had refused to die. She had survived. On the 5th day, she opened the door, stepped outside into air so cold it felt liquid, looked south toward the valley. No smoke rose from her chimney. She had let the fire die during the worst of the fever. From below, from the valley, from any vantage point where someone might look up toward Harrow Ridge, the dugout would have appeared dead. A structure without smoke in February at 9,000 feet was either abandoned or occupied by someone in serious trouble. Thaddeus Briggs arrived that afternoon. His mule picked its way up the snow-choked trail with careful, deliberate footwork. Briggs himself was covered in snow to the waist, his hat pulled so low his eyes were barely visible, his face red, raw from the wind. He found Wren outside the door, splitting kindling with the hatchet. She was pale, visibly, alarmingly pale. Her movements were slower than usual, each swing of the hatchet calculated to conserve some energy she did not have to spare. Didn't see smoke. His voice carried no emotion beyond the factual observation itself. Caught a fever. Let the fire go. She set another piece of kindling on the block, split it with a single measured stroke. I'm all right now. I see that. He reached behind the mule, untied a canvas bundle, set it on the snow beside the door. Food from Hattie bread, salt pork, a jar of preserved peaches, a small bottle of brandy. Medicine from Doc Pruitt, more quinine, a packet of willow bark powder, a note in the doctor's cramped handwriting that read simply, "Take the bark tea twice daily. Do not argue." Briggs did not come inside. He did not ask questions, offer advice, deliver lectures about the foolishness of living alone at this altitude. He had climbed a mountain in February because he had not seen smoke. He had brought what was needed. That was all. He remounted, turned the mule south. paused. The old man survived 20 winters up here by himself. His voice reached her through the cold air, quiet, carrying the weight of something he had thought about but had not said until now, a jat. He told me once that the mountain doesn't try to kill you. It just doesn't try to save you. The difference between living up here, dying up here, is knowing that you're the only one responsible for which one happens. He rode down the trail. The sound of the mule's hooves on frozen ground faded into silence. Wren stood in the doorway, the hatchet in one hand, the fossil stone pressing its weight against her thigh. Thaddeus Briggs did not waste words. If he had spoken, it was because the speaking mattered. She went inside, built the fire back to full strength, made the willow bark tea dock Pruitt had prescribed, drank it, grimacing at the bitterness, ate a piece of Hattie's bread, slowly, carefully, feeling her body accept the nourishment with something like gratitude. Then she sat at the table, took out the boxwood rule, returned to the cabinet she had been building before the fever. The joint she had been cutting was still there, half finished. She picked up the chisel, resumed. The winter continued. She did not get sick again. Spring announced itself not with drama but with arithmetic. The days grew longer by minutes, 2, 3, 5, the sun, climbing a little higher each noon, lingering a little longer each evening. The snow did not melt so much as retreat, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then from the exposed ridges, then from the sheltered north-facing pockets where it had accumulated deepest. By late March, the trail down to Sulfur Flats was passable. Wren descended for the first time in 4 months, carrying a list of supply seeds for a garden, more nails, a length of rope, salt, coffee. Her legs, accustomed to the flat floor of a 12-foot room, protested the steep descent. She reached town in the late morning. Sulfur Flats looked different after a winter of absence, smaller. Somehow, the buildings that had once seemed substantial now appearing fragile, temporary structures perched on the surface of the earth rather than rooted in it. She was crossing the wooden sidewalk toward Coombs' store when she saw Vivienne. The woman stood outside the dry goods shop 3 doors down, a package under her arm. She had come from Verlone to settle the last of Garrett's affairs in Sulfur Flats, the sale of his small business office, some remaining debts to collect. Her posture was still rigid, but something in it had diminished the way a fence post that has weathered a hard winter still stands upright but carries, in the slight line of its grain, the evidence of the forces it has endured. The severity that had once seemed like strength now looked brittle, the sharpness of her features no longer commanding but exposed. Their eyes met across 30 feet of muddy boardwalk. Wren did not stop. She did not alter her pace, her direction, the expression on her face. She simply walked, her boots leaving prints in the spring mud, her body carrying the easy, balanced gait of someone whose center of gravity has been tested by terrain far more challenging than a wooden sidewalk. Vivienne spoke first. Her voice crossed the distance between them with less force than it once possessed. "They told me you're still up there, on the ridge." Wren stopped, turned, not because she felt obligated to respond, but because something in Vivienne's tone, an uncertainty that had never been there before, made her curious. "I am. Through the whole winter?" "Through the whole winter." A silence. Vivienne's mouth opened, closed the motion of someone who has prepared a speech, rehearsed it, only to discover, at the moment of delivery, that the words no longer apply, that the person they were written for no longer exists. Whatever Vivienne had intended to say died on her lips. The young woman standing before her was not the same girl who had been sent away with $17 a year ago. That girl had been quiet, compliant, wounded. This woman was something else. This woman had a calmness that was not passive but structural, the calmness of a wall that knows its own weight, a chimney that knows its own draw. It was not a quality that could be argued with, condescended to, managed. Wren held the gaze for another moment. Then, without rancor, without triumph, without anything beyond a simple, civil acknowledgement of another person's existence. "Good day, Mrs. Calloway." She turned, walked into Coombs' store, bought her seeds, her nails, her rope, her salt, her coffee, walked out, began the climb back up. Somewhere behind her, Vivienne stood on the boardwalk, the package under her arm, watching the young woman's figure grow smaller. As the trail steepened, as the pines closed around her, as the mountain took her back, spring opened the ridge like a hand unclenching. The snow pulled back to reveal the dark earth beneath, wet, rich, smelling of minerals, decomposition, the fertile rot of a season's worth of organic material being broken down into the building blocks of new growth. The grasses pushed up through the turf of the sod roof, turning the brown surface green in patches that spread daily. Wren dug her garden on the east-facing slope, 30 paces from the dugout door. The soil was thin mountain soil, always is, but she improved it by mixing in charcoal from the hearth, decomposed pine needles from the forest floor, the contents of the small compost heap she had maintained through the winter. She planted kale, onions, squash, hardy crops that could handle the short-growing season. She built a low stone wall around the plot. The dark stone absorbed heat during the day, radiated it back to the soil through the cold mountain nights, extending the growing season by precious weeks. It was during this work, kneeling in the dirt, her hands black to the wrists, the sun warm on her back for the first time in months, that Doc Pruitt made his spring visit. She heard him before she saw him, the measured, slightly uneven tread of a man whose knees had filed a formal complaint against mountain trails decades ago, but whose stubbornness had overruled the objection. He came around the last switchback, breathing hard, his medical bag in one hand, his hat in the other. She brought him coffee. He sat on the log where Hattie had sat the previous summer. Summer caught his breath, looked around at the dugout with the critical eye of a man whose profession was the assessment of structural integrity in buildings, in bodies, in the arrangements people made to keep themselves alive. "You look thin," he observed with the blunt directness of a doctor who had long ago abandoned polite fictions. "But you look sound. The fever did its damage. You repaired it." He sipped his coffee, set the cup on the log, reached into the medical bag, brought out, not medicine, but a small folded piece of paper. "Healed." He held it for a moment, looking at it with an expression she had not seen on his face before, tenderness, or something close to it, an emotion that did not sit comfortably on the features of a man who had spent 40 years keeping his feelings at professional distance. "I treated Obadiah Mercer in his last months, at Hattie's boarding house in 75. He was failing lungs, mostly the slow kind that gives you time to think about it, which is the cruelest part. He placed the paper on the log between them. He gave me this, told me to hold it, said if anyone ever took up residence on the ridge again, I should pass it along." Wren picked up the paper, unfolded it. The handwriting was Obadiah's. She recognized it from the letter in the box, but weaker, trembling, the letters formed by a hand that was losing its grip on the tools it had used all its life. 3 lines. Her name was Rosie Ann Mercer, born April 12, 1865. She loved birds. She always asked me why birds don't get cold in winter. Wren read the words, read them again. Felt something move inside her chest that she could not name, not grief, exactly, because she had never known Rosie Mercer. Something else. The particular ache of encountering a life that was complete, beginning, middle, end, summarized in 3 sentences by the person who had loved it most. A name, a birthday, a curiosity about birds. That was all that remained of Rosie Mercer on the written record of the world. That, the carved bird on the shelf inside the dugout, the letter in the ammunition box, the hearth her father had built with such fierce, meticulous care. She folded the paper along its original creases, tucked it into her shirt pocket, the same pocket where she carried the fossil stone, the 2 objects resting together against her heart. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet but steady. Doc Pruitt nodded, finished his coffee, left the bottle of quinine he had brought for next winter, which will come whether you want it to or not, gathered his bag, his hat, began the descent. At the trailhead he turned back. He was a good man, Wren. Mercer. Not happy. I don't think he was happy a single day after he lost them. But good. There's a difference most people never learn. Goodness doesn't require happiness. It only requires the decision to act with care, even when the world has given you every reason not to. He disappeared into the pines. The mountain silence returned, not empty but full, populated by the wind, the distant call of a Clark's nutcracker, the sound of snowmelt running through cracks in the granite far below. Summer came to Harrow Ridge, the way summer comes to high places briefly, intensely, with an urgency born of the knowledge that it will not last. The meadows erupted in wildflowers, columbine, Indian paintbrush, alpine sunflower, a riot of color that lasted 6 weeks before the first frosts of September would kill it back. A family arrived in Sulfur Flats in early June. Edmund Hale, his wife, their 3 children refugees, from a played-out mine south of Leadville, carrying everything they owned in a single wagon. Hale was a stonemason by training, a miner by necessity, a man whose hands knew how to shape rock but whose luck had never put him in a position to use that knowledge for his own benefit. They were living in a canvas tent near the rail yard, cooking over an open fire. Hattie mentioned them during one of her visits. Not as a request, Hattie was too tactful for that, but as information, offered without commentary, trusting the listener to draw her own conclusions. Wren drew hers. She found Edmund Hale at the rail yard on her next trip down. He was splitting wood for the cook fire. His technique competent, but uneconomical, too much energy in each stroke, the axe head meeting the grain at the wrong angle, producing ragged splits instead of clean ones. She watched him for a minute before speaking. "You're fighting the wood. Let it show you where it wants to break." He looked up. A man in his mid-30s, weathered beyond his years, his eyes carrying the particular wariness of someone who has been disappointed, often enough to distrust kindness. "You Calloway? The one on the ridge?" "I am. People say you built your place alone. Not entirely alone, but mostly." She did not offer money. She did not offer to share her home. The dugout was too small, built for solitude. What she offered instead was something she had received from Cormac, then from Obadiah's letter, then from the mountain itself. She offered knowledge. She took Edmund Hale up the south slope of Harrow Ridge, the face that caught the afternoon sun, sheltered from the northern gales, near a second spring that ran clear, cold, year-round, through a cleft in the granite. She showed him how to read the terrain. She showed him how to read the terrain, where the bedrock was closest to the surface, where the prevailing winds would hit hardest, where the snow would drift deepest, where the morning sun would reach first. She taught him what Cormac had taught her, how to tap a stone to test its integrity, how to read the grain to predict where it would split, how to lay a foundation that would distribute weight evenly, that would resist the upward pressure of frost heave, the lateral push of wind, the downward pull of gravity. She stayed for 2 weeks. They laid the foundation together, selecting stones from the slope, carrying them to the site, fitting them with the patience that the work demanded. Hale was a quick study, his hands remembering skills they had not been allowed to practice. His wife brought food to the work soak site at noon, simple meals, bread with salt pork, the last of their dried apples, shared without ceremony on flat rocks overlooking the canyon. On the final day, as Wren prepared to return to her own place, Hale stood looking at the 2 walls they had raised waist-high, solid, plumb, the stones fitted with a tightness that would keep out wind, water, the slow intrusion of time. "Why?" His voice carried genuine bewilderment. "We can't pay you. We've got nothing to offer." She thought about Obadiah's letter, lying in its ammunition box behind the hearthstone. The words she had read so many times they had become part of her internal architecture, load-bearing walls in the structure of her own understanding. "Someone did the same for me once. The only payment is to do it for the next person." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, the same slow, deliberate nod Briggs had given when the ridgepole settled into its notch, the nod that contains everything that needs to be said without the diminishment of actually saying it. She climbed back to Calloway Hold. Behind her, below her, a second dugout was beginning to take shape on the south face of Harrow Ridge. The sound of Hale's hammer striking stone followed her up the trail. The sound of building, the sound of someone learning the language that Cormac had spoken, that Obadiah had practiced in solitude, that she was now passing forward into hands she had not known existed a month ago. July 1888. 1 year since Wren Calloway had walked up this mountain with nothing. Hattie Drummond organized the gathering without calling it a celebration. She understood. that Wren was not a person who wanted to be celebrated, that the act of gathering people in her name would make her uncomfortable in a way that gathering them around food would not. So she brought food, a roasted chicken, bread, pie. Coombs contributed a small barrel of cider he had been saving. Doc Pruitt brought himself his dry humor, a jar of honey he had traded for with a beekeeper in the valley. Briggs brought nothing, because Briggs brought himself, which was a gift that did not fit in a basket. Edmund came with his wife, his children. The children ran between the rocks, chasing each other, their laughter thin, bright in the mountain air, a sound that had not been heard on Harrow Ridge since Rosie Mercer was alive. They sat on rocks, on logs, on the grass beside the dugout. They ate. They talked in the comfortable, unhurried way of people who have nowhere else to be. The late afternoon sun fell warm on their faces. The valley spread below them in shades of green gold, the far peaks still holding snow on their highest crests. No one made speeches. No one proposed toasts. The gathering had no agenda beyond presence, the simple, radical act of people choosing to be in the same place at the same time, because they wanted to be. Wren sat among them with the quiet composure of someone who has found her position in the world, not at the center, not at the edge, but exactly where she needed to be. She listened to Hattie's and stories, laughed at Doc Pruitt's observations about the declining quality of the whiskey at the saloon in town, watched the Hale children playing with a focus that was not sadness, but recognition that this ridge had once held a child's laughter before, that it was holding it again, that the circle was turning. The snow came early that second winter. Late October, the first flakes falling past the glass window in the long, slow descent that she recognized now not as a threat but as a transition, the mountain putting on its winter face, the world narrowing to the essential. She sat at her table on the evening of the first snowfall. The fire in the hearth burned steady, the flames casting their familiar dance on the stone walls. The stew simmered. The coffee steamed. The room smelled of pine smoke, food, the particular warmth of a space that is not merely heated but inhabited, lived in, cared for. On the shelf, 3 objects rested together. The carved bird honey pine, silk smooth, its head tilted, listening. The fossil stone gray blue cool, the fern pressed into its surface with the precision of something that was meant to last longer than the world that produced it. Between them, folded small, the piece of paper Doc Pruitt had given her. Rosie Ann Mercer, born April 12, 1865, she loved birds. 3 relics, 3 lives. 3 griefs transformed, not erased, not healed, not overcome, but transformed, the way pressure transforms stone, the way time transforms a leaf into a fossil, the way a man's love for his dead daughter transforms into a carved bird left in a box for a stranger, the way a grandfather's love for his orphaned granddaughter transforms into a stone placed in a palm by a creek on a morning when the world had ended. She was the keeper of these objects, the holder of these stories, the living intersection of 2 lines of loss that had converged against all probability in this 12-foot room on the top of a mountain in Colorado. She picked up her mending. The needle moved through the fabric with the same measured pace she brought to every task, not hurried, not slow, each stitch placed with intention, each repair made to last. Outside, the snow thickened, the flakes growing larger, heavier, falling faster. The world beyond the glass was disappearing into white. She thought of Cormac kneeling by the creek, his rough hands gentle among the stones. She thought of Obadiah at his desk in Hattie's boarding house, his hand trembling, as he wrote 3 lines about a girl who loved birds. She thought of Briggs climbing a mountain in February because he hadn't seen smoke, of Hattie carrying a basket on a gray mare, of Doc Pruitt leaving quinine on the shelf with gruff instructions to survive. She thought of Garrett, sitting in a house in Denver, looking at 5 words on a torn margin of newspaper. "I'm all right. Roof holds." Wren Calloway was 19 years old. She had been cast out of her home at 18 with $17 in a linen pouch. She spent 15 of those dollars on a mining claim the entire town called worthless, a hole in a mountain, a dead man's folly, a punchline to a story about failure. It was the best $15 she would ever spend. The fire burned, the snow fell, the mountain held. Inside the walls that Obadiah Mercer had built with his broken heart, on the foundation that Cormac Calloway had taught her to read, Wren sat in the home she had made with her own 2 hands, the home that no one could take from her, because she had not been given it. She had built it, stone by stone, board by board, joint by joint. From the rubble of what others had discarded, she had constructed something that would stand.